Hello, we are Group 4 of the Wednesday tutorial at 10:30 a.m. I'm joined by my lovely team of highly trained and professional analysts and consultants, Christine, Lauren, Mira, and myself, Daniel. We have been approached by a company looking to open branches in Asian countries as well as non-Asian ones, and have been asked for consulting advice. They want to understand the kind of service representatives that they should hire, which would attract better customer satisfaction, which we can help determine with an analysis of the data collected. There are 4 conditions in this survey that respondents were exposed to, which are as follows. I'll give an overview of the basic demographics of the data collected. In terms of gender, 46.7% were male and 53.3% were female. The highest age frequency is 18 to 25, making up 84.2%. 86% of the candidates were single in terms of relationship status. 40.9% of people have 4 members in their family. The majority of respondents were from the Oceania region, making up 54.2%. A limitation to this is that this is only their country of origin, which does not specify their race or their ethnicity. In terms of the data collected, there were several aspects that were needed to be cleaned. Firstly, we recoded country by origin into Asian or non-Asian. Secondly, we changed some other measures for some variables, such as if they were nominal, ordinal, or scale. Thirdly, we cleaned data of all the respondents who were not paying attention. So out of the 2,471 survey respondents, only 74.1% correctly answered the attention question. Therefore, only 1,830 responses were analysed, and the other 641 were deemed invalid. I will now pass it on to Lauren.
Before we conduct the test, there are some key assumptions for the test we need to take into consideration. These being normality of the data, linearity of the data, and equal variances. The first research aim we seek to answer from this dataset is which of the 4 conditions between the service representative and the customer achieve the highest level of overall satisfaction with the service. In order to answer this question, we first need to know what variables we are dealing with in order to pick the most appropriate test to answer this question. There are 2 variables we are dealing with in this question, the first being the overall satisfaction with the service, which is a scale variable, as this question was answered on a 7-point Likert scale, rating from very satisfied to very unsatisfied. The second being the 4 conditions between the service representative and the customer, this being a nominal variable, as the 4 conditions relate to the race of the service representative and the customer. We need to use a test which can determine if there is a relationship between the race of the service representative and the customer's overall satisfaction with the service. A one-way ANOVA test is able to do so. A one-way ANOVA test is an analysis of variance test, which tests to see whether groups have the same average values. In order to conduct an ANOVA test, a discrete variable, either a nominal or ordinal, with more than 2 groups, and a scale variable are required. Thus, an ANOVA test is a highly appropriate test to use in order to answer this current question. When we conduct the ANOVA test, the independent variable, or the manipulated variable, will be the race of the service representative and the customer, or in other words, the 4 conditions between the service representative and the customer. The dependent variable, or the variable being measured, is the overall satisfaction with the service. The null hypotheses will be the overall satisfaction with the service does not differ between the 4 conditions of the service representative and the customer. And the alternate hypotheses is that the overall satisfaction with the service differs between the 4 conditions of the service representative and the customer. From this test, we will look at the test values, and by comparing the p-value to 0.05, we will be able to determine whether this test was significant and whether or not we can reject or fail to reject the null hypotheses. Depending on the outcome of the test, we may need to either conduct a post hoc test to determine which groups have the highest amount of variance, as this is not given to us through a hypotheses test. If the hypotheses test outcome is found to be significant, we will conduct a post hoc test for the variables. The post hoc we will choose will be dependent upon whether or not variances are equal in the Levine's test. If Levine's test results demonstrate a p-value greater than 0.05, this means equal variance is assumed and a Tukey post hoc test will need to be undertaken. If Levine's p-value is less than 0.05, this means variances aren't equal and a Temhane test will be conducted to examine which groups show the most variance, or in other words, which of the 4 conditions between the service representative and the customer resulted in the highest level of satisfaction with the service. If the overall ANOVA hypothesis test outcome was found to be insignificant, we will examine the means plot of the results and conduct an independent t-test between the groups with the maximum and minimum means. This is to double check whether the differences between the groups truly exist. This being necessary as ANOVA assumes equal variances, therefore if the variances are different, ANOVA may not come out with a significant result. Depending upon the results from these tests, managers can decide whether they need to pair certain groups together based on race in order to achieve the highest level of overall customer satisfaction. This having vast implications for the human resources process for this company, as if tests demonstrate there is a strong relationship between the race of the service provider and the customer to overall satisfaction, managers will have to specifically hire sales representatives based on different characteristics in order to maximise the customer's satisfaction depending on their origin. The next speaker will be Cindy.
Our next objective is to determine whether various demographics of the respondents differ in affecting the overall satisfaction of the service. In order to answer this question, we have chosen 4 different demographics that we believe are the most relevant to our managerial objective. These are gender, age, education level, and employment status. For the gender demographic, we will run an independent t-test to determine whether there is a relationship between overall satisfaction and gender. There are 2 variables, the dependent variable being the overall satisfaction of the service and the independent variable being the gender of the respondent. The reason we run this test is because there's 1 scale and 1 categorical variable. Gender has 2 groups, male or female, and we assume that the samples are independent as they can only belong to one or the other. Next, we developed 2 hypotheses for this equation. The null hypothesis is that the mu's are the same. Thus, males and females do not differ when determining overall satisfaction, and there is no relationship between the 2. The alternate hypothesis is that mu's are not equal, and thus gender is an important variable to consider when training and hiring service representatives. As we run the tests, we need to look at the results from the Levines to determine whether variances are equal, and then the relevant p-values to see whether we reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis. From this, we will know whether men and women need to be treated differently when providing them with the service. For the other demographics, we will use a one-way ANOVA test to analyze the average of the groups to determine whether there are any differences. As the independent variables of the age, education, and employment status are all categorical variables with more than 2 groups, this test is the most suitable to answer this question. As before, the dependent variable will be the overall satisfaction of the service. For this test, the null hypothesis is that there is a difference between the groups of the chosen demographics, and thus there is no relationship between the independent variables and overall satisfaction. The alternate hypothesis is that overall satisfaction differs between groups of the chosen demographics, and thus there is no relationship. Once we have run this test, we look at the p-values and determine what kind of further testing we need to perform. If the hypothesis test turns out to be significant, we conduct a post hoc test determined by the results of the Levines. If variances are equal, a 2-key test will be used to determine which groups have the largest variance, and if variances are not equal, we will rely on Temhane for this answer. If the p-value for the test turns out to be insignificant, we will use an independent t-test between the groups with the maximum and minimum means to verify that no differences actually exist between the 2 groups. From these tests of demographics, managers can use this information to gain an understanding of whether different groups of people need different types of attention from the customer service representatives. Groups with the lowest overall satisfaction can be filtered as areas of focus, and managers can conduct further research on why this is so. Managers need to hire and train their customer service representatives according to their findings in order to maximize customer satisfaction. I will now pass on to Zinthi for our next research objective.
The third objective for our presentation is to find out which certain attributes are valued more than other attributes by the two groups of customers, Asians and non-Asians. These attributes are important because they play a significant role in determining the overall satisfaction of the customers with the service that are being provided to them. Hence, this leads us to how useful these objectives are to management. So, as mentioned earlier, as these factors play an important role in determining the overall satisfaction of the customers, management must have a good knowledge of the different attributes that are valued most by the customer in order to provide exceptional service and in return gain optimal satisfaction from the customers in the different regions. With this knowledge, management will have a clearer idea of what traits a service representative of the company should possess, and consequently, if they are hiring new representatives in Asia or non-Asian regions, management will be acquainted with what traits to look for in potential employees. So for this, the test we have decided to run is unconstrained linear regression, and we have decided to run this test because we wish to include all the variables of interest in the model and list all the independent variables to estimate the model and find out the rankings of each variable. And the dependent variable for this case will be the overall satisfaction with the service, and the independent variables will be the factors that are listed on the slide. And as for the selection variable, we will have to choose country of origin by region because we wish to learn more about the customers based on the country of origin divided by the region. And in this case, that will be Asians and non-Asians. So for this test, the null hypothesis will be that there is no relationship between the independent variables and the dependent variable, which is the overall satisfaction. And the alternative hypothesis will be that there is a relationship between the independent variable and the independent variables and the dependent variable. So after running this test, there are 3 steps to follow. The first step is to identify whether the models are significant for both group of customers, Asians and non-Asians. And for step 2, we have to identify how much of the dependent variable is explained by the independent variable, and for that we have to look at the R-square values. And lastly, we will have to check whether there's a negative correlation or a positive correlation with overall satisfaction from the coefficients table. And just to explain a little bit, a perfectly negative correlation has a coefficient of -1, indicating that an increase in one variable reliably predicts a decrease in another one. So for example, a good for this case is that if a customer finds a service representative to be rude, their level of overall satisfaction with the service they receive will decrease. On the other hand, a positive correlation indicates has a coefficient of +1, which indicates that a increase or decrease in one variable always predicts the same directional change for the second variable. Another example is that if the customer finds the service representative to be happy or attentive, the level of overall satisfaction with the service they receive will generally increase. We have also observed that customers do not actually value personal touch, as there is no relationship between personal touch and overall satisfaction. Now I will pass on the presentation to Daniel to move on to the 4th objective of this presentation. Thank you.
The 4th objective we are looking at is if there is a relationship between Asians and non-Asians and the importance of rules and regulations. For this, we would run an independent t-test for this question. The reason we would run this is because this test examines the differences between 2 groups in which one variable must be a categorical variable with 2 groups, an ordinal or a nominal, and the other variable must be a scale variable in which this question satisfies the test. Once we run the test and record the necessary figures, we can determine whether or not to reject our null hypothesis, and in this case, the null hypothesis is mu's are equal, therefore there is no relationship. And the alternate hypothesis is mu's are not equal, therefore there is a relationship. We would look at the Levine's F value and also the P value to see whether it is significant and if you should assume variances are not equal. If the following P values are significant, then you can reject the null hypothesis, which means there is a relationship. If there is a relationship, we can then proceed to run a linear regression in which we can determine which group perceives rules and regulations as more important. To gain an understanding of how rules and regulations reflect a customer's socio-cultural values, which in turn affects the values being sought after in the hiring of a service representative, is the managerial use for this question. And I'll pass it on to Lauren to go through the roadmap.
So I'm going to briefly talk about the roadmap of our project. As conducted today, we've talked about all the objectives for our project, both managerial and marketing. Then we've outlined the managerial usefulness of these objectives. Then we've also decided on the types of tests we are going to conduct and why. So next we have to do is run the tests as well as clean up the data. Then after we run the tests and clean up the data, we are going to interpret the results, and from these results we are going to make some recommendations and discuss some of the limitations of these results. Then we are going to finally come up with our final report, and that will be the end of our presentation. Thank you.